Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer. Today I'm joined by Peter Brimelow, the founder and editor of VDare.com. He is also the author of the New York Times bestseller, Alienation, which is celebrating its 25th anniversary this month. Peter, welcome to the show. How are you today?
Thank you for having me on, Scott.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. Now, I mostly want to talk about alienation today and its impact, but I first want to discuss President Trump's immigration moratorium. On Monday, Trump tweeted that he would temporarily stop all immigration to the U.S. VDare has long advocated for an immigration moratorium, and this seemed like a triumph for nationalist ideas. But what he delivered on Tuesday was a major disappointment. All guest worker visas would be exempt from the order, and the moratorium was announced to cover only 60 days. Peter, what do you make of this?
I think it's a typical Trump flub up, isn't it? I mean, the way, as far as I can make out, you know, the White House is basically run by conventional Republicans who they're generally friendly to business, which they interpret as doing what the lobbyists want, and they're generally terrified of political correctness, which is why Darren Beattie was fired because he had appeared in a conference with me, and then they have this
terrifying offense.
Yeah, then they have this president who's rampaging around. And apparently, when I saw that, his tweet, I tweeted out myself, you know, does anybody in the White House know about this? And it turns out that they didn't. He was just, according to the New York Times, he'd been repeatedly asking, where's this moratorium? And eventually got fed up and tweeted out he was going to announce one, apparently just to force them to do something. So this is what they've come up with, you know, the minimal. It's really a symbolic effort. I've seen commentary to the effect that they've told the media that they're really just doing to draw attention to how far immigration has been shut down because of the coronavirus. And they think this will stir up the base. But, you know, the fact is he's got the issue in play. I mean, it's 28 years since I first started writing about immigration moratorium in National Review. And that's a long time. And I guess I've learned to be patient, you know, throughout the Great Recession, when the unemployment got up to over 10%. You know, you could get nobody in there.
No one talked about it then, or no politicians at least.
Oh no, that's right. I mean, we talked about it. Of course, Buchanan talked about it in Suicide of a Superpower and so on, but it just never entered mainstream media discussion. I genuinely think that I think the media is pretty closely controlled, and they don't want this term getting into public, or this concept getting into public discourse, because they know how incredibly popular it is. I mean, it's an 80-20 issue according to polls at the moment. Yeah. That's why I'm very curious to see that the new born again Democrat Drudge report has never mentioned this. That Trump tweeted this out.
Drudge is having a lot of loopy ideas. I mean, I believe Trump or somebody who's very close to him tweeted out like a Ben Garrison cartoon mocking him as an SJW recently. You know, everyone is like attacking Drudge at the moment. He's gotten very weird over the last year or two, and that of course he's not going to mention, even though this is one of the biggest news events. You know, the last few weeks. For some reason, this is of no interest to Matt Drudge.
I think I think Drudge is not running the show anymore. I think it's being run by a bunch of somewhat conventional journalists, and of course, like any other conventional journalist, if you fire at them at random, you're going to hit a Democrat. So they're following basically Democrat talking points. It just doesn't occur to them that this will be a popular issue. Although, as I say, Scott, I really do think, and I think that journalist scandal in 2008 showed that the elite media collude very closely as to what lines they're going to allow and what lines they won't allow. And I don't think they want the concept of immigration moratorium getting out there.
Oh, and they don't. I mean, they were terrified when he announced this. They were saying, we got all the usual slurs about Trump being a Hitler and a Nazi, and this is what the Nazis wanted, yada, yada, yada. This is white supremacy, blah, blah, blah. They were thinking that this is the worst thing to ever happen, that he had perhaps blown up the Statue of Liberty when he even suggested this in a tweet. And even there were some, you know, people who are respectable pundits who go on cable news who are essentially saying he should be removed from office for even suggesting this idea. There is a strong...
Did somebody say that? Did somebody say that? I don't watch
to the effect.
Yeah, right.
I remember Evelyn Farkas, who was a high-ranking official in the Obama administration was freaking out about this, saying this is the worst thing ever. How can we live in this country that would even suggest a temporary halt? And they, of course, ignore the fact that, as you previously brought up, that 80% of Americans support an immigration moratorium during the coronavirus. I mean, they all know that we have over 20 million Americans out of work, that this is not a time to be bringing in cheap foreign labor to compete with people who are unemployed or struggling to retain those jobs that they have, that this is not a popular idea with anyone outside of political journalism and big corporations. And so they don't want this idea to enter it because they know that it's going to be a popular idea, and it's another way that Trump could potentially win the 2020 election.
It's quite heartbreaking. I was watching this afternoon. I'm on for some reason on the email list of The Week magazine, and they have this fellow Damon Link, the columnist. Do you know him? And he wrote a column obviously before the Tuesday night when Trump announced the details of this thing, and he was basically saying that this was a master stroke, and the Democrats are in a terrible position because they drifted too far to the left, and Trump's going to be appealing to people in the Midwest who he needs to, I mean, they know perfectly well that it's a winning issue. But the question, what is it that the Republicans think, and particularly the ones inside the White House, if anything? I mean,
they want to ignore the issue of immigration. I mean, there's been many times where they could have pointed out this issue. This has been a major crisis for a few months now, and no Republican lawmaker in Congress has suggested anything like this or to do anything about immigration, like this is the full time to have full funding for the wall, because this clearly shows that we can have pandemics and other viruses come through our porous border, and when we don't have a good immigration system, we're allowing these threats to come. Yet no Republican suggests that. No Republican is suggesting anything about restricting Chinese immigration, even though they all want to punish China. None of them feel the need to restrict visas to Chinese nationals for whatever reason. And Trump is being better than the rest of the Republican Congress, even though I think there are some members like Matt Gaetz, Paul Gosar, maybe a few others who would, fully support this idea and may even propose a tougher moratorium in response to Trump's disappointing proposal that he had yesterday. But they're not the ones leading on this. I mean, the only two major figures who were suggesting a moratorium before this was Charlie Kirk, surprisingly enough,
and I think
and Jeff Sessions.
I think it's very interesting that Kirk, who I regard as rats don't swim towards sinking ships. And
exactly.
After Kirk tweeted in favor of a moratorium, and this Javanka proposal came out on Tuesday night, he then tweeted again in favor of a moratorium, and specifically cutting off the temporary visas, which is apparently what big business is making its stand on at the moment. So
he stood against what Trump offered, which is interesting because he's always. I'm pretty sure this is the one time I've ever seen a streak of independence of Charlie Kirk since Trump's been in office against what Trump proposes. Because anything Trump proposes, he's usually like, this, boom, retweet. This is the greatest thing to ever happen.
Right.
But here he was criticizing it without criticizing Trump. He was criticizing the policy without mentioning Trump.
Michael Kinsley once said that insincere flattery is even better than sincere flattery, because it means that people are afraid of you. And this is whatever Kirk's motive is here, the fact that he's still standing with an immigration moratorium must think that he thinks it's a winning issue. As of course it is. And I said in what I wrote about it, that at least he's got the issue in play. That was a term that was popular in the 80s on Wall Street. If somebody made a takeover bid for a public company, then it was considered to be in play, in the sense that even if that one bid failed, another bid would be made, and bids would go on until somebody won, or somebody actually succeeded in taking the company over. And now, of course, Trump has said he might extend this thing, and he can expand it, and it's in play. The issue is on the table, which it frankly hasn't been, despite our best efforts for nearly 30 years.
Yeah, and I think he will definitely extend it. I don't know what's going to happen with the guest worker visas. What the news reports say that they wanted to limit certain categories of it, but they determined that it was too complex, so they decided to let all of it instead of shutting down all of them. I think there are definitely going to be changes to this. He's definitely going to extend it because we're going to have the economic devastation of this is going to last much longer than 60 days. And the American public is going to be wanting a greater, more expanded moratorium than this. But his White House is knowing that this is a politically powerful move, because they're all going out there and saying 80% of Americans support this, even though this isn't necessarily what the 80% wanted. They're saying that this is better than anything Democrats are suggesting. And they're all saying that Trump is putting the American worker first and Democrats are not. So they know that this is a politically powerful move to do, but they're not implementing it in the way it should. So I am optimistic that he'll.
I think the one thing that made me optimistic is, it was a very easy thing for him to tweet out that he was doing this because of the virus. But he didn't. He said it was because of the virus and unemployment. And that's a very good sign, because it means he's focused on the supply aspect of the labor market. He realizes that it's an answer to unemployment to cut off the supply of labor. I don't know if you remember this, but I guess more than 10 years ago, Sarah Palin was on with Bill O'Reilly. And O'Reilly said to her, of course, even if you've been elected in 2008, he said, really, what could you have done in the face of this tremendous surge of unemployment that followed the 2008-9 recession? And she agreed with him. She said, yes, it wasn't clear what they could have done, this, that. No, of course, the obvious thing to do is have an immigration moratorium. But the thought had never crossed her mind or his. I mean, the entire political elite at that point, they just didn't think about it. Of course, it had me clawing the walls. And for that matter, Michelle Malkin has been saying this since 2000, and so has Pat Buchanan.
And Coulter, and
cannot get this through people's heads, through the political class's heads. And I think, I genuinely think it wasn't that, in some cases, it wasn't that they were deliberately avoiding the issue, which I think is the case with the media. I think that these Republican parties, it just hadn't occurred to them. They're entirely dependent on the Conservative Inc. media, and Conservative Inc. media and the Wall Street Journal and so on, simply weren't discussing it, even as a possibility. Well, now
that was something they would never even think of.
Right.
They're like stopping illegal immigration, but we're for legal immigration. They've always said this, that we're against illegal immigration, but we're for legal immigration. But an immigration moratorium would actually expand it to include both. And I mean, the threat is not just illegal immigration, it's legal immigration. And prior to Trump, very few Republicans would even mention this point or even notice this, especially in politicians. But we are seeing a change. Tucker Carlson last night was raking Trump over the coals for this neutered moratorium. And I think even Laura Ingraham was criticizing him for it. That's far different than the primetime lineup would have done, just a few years ago. So there are positive developments. I mean, the president of the United States suggesting this is a win, but we want the proper implementation. But
the thing is, you do have to give him credit for it. I mean, he does have instincts. I mean, he's not getting this from listening to cable television, really. He has very good instincts. And he comes out with these things, even though everybody around him is against it. So and that's why I think that at some point he's going to return to birthright citizenship. People think that he raised the issue of birthright citizenship. That is to say, preventing the children of people in the country who are born in this country but may not have legal status. The children have legal status because they're born on the inside the U.S. The children of illegal immigrants are counted as American citizens. And that's a very problematic thing from a legal point of view. And most common law jurisdictions have given it up. Just before the midterm election, Trump happened to mention it. People think that he did it a deliberate effort to stir up the base, but he didn't. He was in an interview situation. And he just mentioned the fact that he'd heard that it could be done, birthright citizenship could be abolished through executive action. Now, that was a discussion that was going on in the White House at the time. They'd been proposed by Mike Anton. But
Trump had suggested this in the 2016 campaign about eliminating birthright citizenship.
Every once in a while he talks about it, but in this occasion, doing it by executive action, I never heard of that before. But obviously he heard about it in the White House, so somebody was asking these questions. He flopped it out. It wasn't a part of a considered plan. It just happened to be on his mind. I think we'll see that again in this year, during this election campaign. And the really bad news about Trump, and he repeated it, I think, in his press conference, is that he appears to have forgotten that he ran on the issue of reducing legal immigration. And his position now is, no, he didn't mean to say that. It's happening now because of an emergency. But he is clearly very much motivated by illegal immigration. Of course, birthright citizenship is a major magnet in illegal immigration. If you can get here and have a kid, that kid is a citizen, and as a practical matter, you can't be deported. So ending that would cut off a serious magnet for illegal immigration. And I think we'll hear him talking more about that, partly because he knows it causes the left to go nuts. They scream and holler, and basically, gets all the publicity he needs from them.
And he knows that he wins a lot by agitating the left and getting them riled up and saying stupid stuff and getting them on the opposing side to Americans and on the side of foreigners is always a winning issue. He does have a way of baiting his opponents into making themselves look so stupid that it benefits himself. And fortunately, he is running against Joe Biden in this election, and he will be easy to bait him, far easier than he did with Hillary Clinton. And there is he understands that there's a tactical advantage to constantly doing this. And by saying things that most Americans agree with, but are afraid to say, such as suggesting a Muslim ban, which arguably helped him win the Republican primary, but everyone was like, oh, he's over. How can he say this? He knows to get these issues that are controversial to stir up people and rile up people and get extreme reactions from his opponents, and to put him on the side of the silent majority. And you're definitely seeing this here with the moratorium. I mean, it's almost all Americans want this. I mean, rarely do you find an issue where 80% of Americans agree that this should happen. And this is a powerful method of stirring up support for him. Joe Biden's not going to suggest anything like this, and he needs to present himself as the pro-worker, especially in a time where we're going to have heightened unemployment. So that is it with the moratorium. But we're moving back to the original topic of why we're coming on, is that we're celebrating the 25th anniversary of the release of Alienation, which, as I said before, and believe it or not, it was a New York Times bestseller because this is a very controversial book. People were very upset when it was originally published, but normal Americans went out and bought it because it had a message that they largely agreed with. And, it did make a huge splash in when it was released in April of 1995. It was discussed in the New York Times and many other prestigious outlets. Most of them were irate, even though I believe New York Times reviews were actually fairly positive. But you can correct me on that, Peter.
There were two New York Times reviews, and they were very positive. I have to say, I'm afraid that it never actually got onto the New York Times bestseller list, although it was on other bestseller lists.
Oh, okay. I've been spreading fake news.
Yeah, but 20 years later, of course, Anne, Adios America, was on the bestseller list for many weeks. Adios America, in many respects, is an updating of. I have great respect for that, for Anne and for her book, but in many respects, it was sort of an updating of Alienation. That was on the New York Times bestseller list for weeks, but it never got a review in the New York Times. She never got the coverage really that I did, because by that time they decided to close down on the issue. There was a brief period of time after the thing was published when the initial conversations I had, I was on Diane Reams with Ben Wattenberg or so, were actually very polite. It took 3 or 4 weeks until they realized how popular the thing is proving, that when they went absolutely became absolutely hysterical. On vdare.com, I have the afterword to the paperback that I wrote at the end of 1995, which goes through the reaction in considerable detail. And it's very amusing how hysterical people became.
At the same time, they were hysterical, but they were taking your point seriously.
In those days, Scott, you see, I was, it's hard to believe now, but I guess I was a contender. I used to be I was regularly invited on television and electronic media to discuss this. The networks weren't very keen on it, but the cable stations were very keen on it and so on. And I used to debate people and all that kind of thing. It took 2 or 3 years before they decided that I was untouchable. And basically, everybody who gets involved in this issue is eventually tarred.
But you did go on with, VDAR's Twitter account recently tweeted out your interview with Brian Gumbel on NBC News, which was one of the major networks. Which is actually, people were remarking about how cordial the interview is, and it's allowing you to go through this argument that today that the journalists would be shrieking at you at, and Brian Gumbel's like, who's a pretty far left liberal, is just sitting there, nodding his head and allowing you to discuss this topic, which is something you wouldn't see today with a book dealing with
right. That was actually the kickoff interview we did on the first day of the. In those days, they used to do very, very specific tours. You wouldn't go on a book tour until what they called the laydown was complete, and the book was in all the stores. So the book would be available for about 2 weeks before you actually started the tour, and that was the beginning of the tour. My impression of Gumbel is that he was genuinely completely stumped by the arguments. He simply never heard them before, and that was the case then. Even on the right, people just had no understanding of simply basic arguments about immigration, such as, for example, supply and demand. The fact that if you increase immigration, you're going to drive down the wages. That was just absolutely categorically denied. Similarly, people didn't realize the extent to which immigrants, and it's true for legal immigrants too, are involved in the welfare system, much more so than Americans are. They just
goes against the stereotype of that they're all entrepreneurs and that they're actually contributing to our tax base. They're taking nothing from our tax base. I mean, the new euphemism for illegal immigrants is tax-paying immigrants without legal status. As I believe Washington Post, or one of the major outlets, tweeted out that phrase, which is more egregious than saying undocumented immigrants. It's now saying that they're almost superior to normal Americans. These are because they're taxpayers, but they're not getting any of the benefits of paying taxes, which is false because their children are attending public schools. They get health care services and everything like that, and they drive on roads and etc. But they're illegal, and they're not really paying that much taxes outside of sales tax.
Yeah, I remember debating. It was at the Hudson Institute actually. Debating their expert, and she produced a restaurateur from Arizona who was agitating against Arizona's various efforts to prevent illegal immigration through public, through initiatives, through referendums, and he went on about how hard these illegals worked, and you really need to have them in his restaurants and so on. And so when I got up, I said to him, "Now tell me, these people work, yes, and they have families, yes, and their families attend school, oh yes, they all attend school, and you pay for it?" And there was like a long silence, and he said, "Well, I pay for my taxes." And I said, "Well, the per pupil cost of a kid in the K through 12 system is like $10,000 a year. Are you paying $10,000 a year for each of these kids who's in the public school system?" Of course, he'd never heard of this argument. Just generally never crossed his mind. I think people are more aware of the welfare costs, the transfer system of immigration. At least that's my impression. What do you think? Do you find people are more aware of it?
Conservatives are definitely more aware of it, but the meme is out there that they're actually contributing more than they're getting. This is due to, Cato Institute and Reason always put out these dubious studies trying to show this, and liberals have really made it clear in their mind that they work harder than Americans, and that they only, they put in a ton of work and taxes into our system, and they're not reaping any rewards. Is that we have to give them legal status to reward them for everything that they've done for our society. And this meme is very powerful, but more people are aware of how they're scheming the welfare system. Every normie conservative website talks about this. We'll run the figures. They'll run Center for Immigration Studies surveys on this issue and everything like that. So it is more out there than probably in 1995, the issue of how they're scheming our system.
The other thing I think that conservatives and Republicans are at least aware of, in a way that they weren't when Alienation came out, is the impact it has on the political system. Basically, the immigrants that the system has selected, that the system selects for, who are predominantly third world immigrants who are poor, simply vote Democratic. So the Democrats benefit enormously from this influx. And at the time, it's hard to believe, but at the time I was on the road with Alienation in 1995, people in the Wall Street Journal, for example, were arguing that seriously arguing that it's just a matter of time. Any moment now, Hispanics are going to change sides and start supporting Republicans.
And they've been saying that for the past 25 years as well. I mean, every year you get a new column saying that this is the year, they're going to do it this time, and every time it's only around 30%.
Right. And I remember talking to someone in the Manhattan conservative catacomb, and I guess it must have been about the 96 election or maybe the 98 election. And he suddenly said to me, well, of course, you're right. He said, I've changed my mind. They're obviously not going to just come over to vote for Republicans. The other thing is that people had no idea how dramatic these systematic differences are in the way in which different ethnic groups vote. I mean, people are vaguely aware that blacks vote 90 to 95% Democratic, but they had no idea how overwhelmingly Hispanics vote, or Asians for that matter.
Especially Asians, because that's something that most Americans would be shocked by, is that Asians actually vote more Democratic than Hispanics. Now, I think it's at least 70%. I think it was 70% or at least so in the 2016 election. And I think it was a higher number in 2018, maybe 75%.
The Asian categories, I mean, all these census categories are rotten, of course, and politically biased in the way they're set up. But I mean, Asian, it would be a good thing if we could distinguish between what we used to call Orientals and Indians and all that kind of thing. And of course, we can't right now. They're all lumped in together. And there may be some systematic differences between them. But I think I would guess offhand that.
But the main difference is actually Southeast Asians are the most likely to vote Republican. I think the majority, I think Vietnamese may have been the only group where it was at least a plurality voted for the Republicans in 2016, and they're considered the more conservative group. And same with Filipinos and other Southeast Asians. But East Asians and South Asians, Indians and Pakistanis, are voting roughly around 75% for the Democratic Party. Right. But that's usually due to them having most of them are attending the more elite schools. I think Indian Americans are the wealthiest group in America, are one of the wealthiest ethnic groups in America, and it's the same with Chinese Americans, Korean Americans, etc. And so they are assimilating to American society. One of the weird things is that a lot of conservatives will say, "Oh, they just need to assimilate, and we can get them on our side." Most studies are showing that the more they assimilate, the more liberal they become, because they assimilate into the white liberal upper class, and they realize that, oh, Trump and Republicans, they're disgusting. You don't want to be D-class like that. You got to vote for Democrats. It's just what their class does. And there was a study that came out in 2018 that showed that Asian immigrants who were less fluent in English and were not born in the United States were more likely to have a favorable opinion of Trump than Asians who were born in the United States and were fluent in English. So
the fundamental point is, why are we taking this risk? Who cares whether they're going to vote more or less Republican? What they're doing here anyway? Why do we have to take this risk? But
exactly. But it's all for. I mean, they all say that, well, we're a nation of immigrants, so we have to take them in. But with your book at the time, as you were alluding to, was a direct challenge to conservative lethargy on this issue. So I have to ask, as you are an immigrant yourself, how did you come to an immigration restrictionist position when the rest of the conservatives were just ignoring it?
Well, I've always been fascinated. Most immigrants are fascinated by immigration, and they tend to be much more skeptical of it than American intellectuals are. They don't buy this Ellis Island myth and all this kind of thing, partly because they've stood in rooms with waiting rooms with other immigrants, and they have a low opinion of them, and they know how irrational and arbitrary the system is and all that. I got really interested in immigration because I was in college in England when Enoch Powell made his great speech in 1968, which is actually one of the great speeches of the language, and goes straight to the issue of national identity and its relationship with ethnicity.
As for listeners, that's Enoch Powell's famous "Rivers of Blood" speech.
That's right.
Which you can Google. Some of my listeners might not be familiar with it.
Right, we have it up on the site with commentary, but he actually, in many respects, was a precursor of Trump, because just with one speech he revolutionized British politics, and had the British had a primary system like Americans do, he would have probably seen what happened with Trump. We forget how amazing what Trump did was. He just gave one. he just made one reference to immigration. He instantly went ahead of the polls, the primary polls, and he stayed there for the rest of the primary season. That would have happened. Power was enormously popular, but of course in Britain you have a parliamentary system, and the establishment has things pretty well sewn up. But anyway, I've been interested in it ever since then. And of course, when I got here, I got to the US in 1970, which was just 2 years after the 1965 Immigration Act had become effective. And it was immediately obvious to us, standing in these rooms and seeing who was actually going to come into the country, that the US is going to be dramatically transformed. But at that stage, there was enormous complacency among American conservatives on the issue, because they just thought the US was too big to influence. Didn't realize how enormous the influx was. I mean, at that stage, the US was 90%
They said in the
white.
65 Act that this would not alter America's demographics. They pleaded with it. I mean, one of the chief critics of the bill, Sam Ervin, who said that this bill it will demographically change America, was duped into believing it wouldn't, and actually voted for the bill, even though it later turned out that he was right. His criticism of the bill was right, but he was duped into it by the bill's proponents. I mean, even Ted Kennedy was going out there and like, oh, this is not going to make any changes to this.
That's right.
And as you were saying in your story, as you know, you were dealing with the immigration process, you were clearly seeing that something was going wrong, and something was changing with America from this bill.
At that stage, of course, I was involved with the National Review. And I remember looking at the National Review archives on immigration. And essentially, they did oppose the 65 Act. And Ernest van den Haag, who was a European refugee, actually, was a significant conservative intellectual in the US and a close friend of the National Review circle, and Buckley and so on, wrote a devastating critique of it. But after that, they simply stopped talking about it. So from 1965, really until 1992, when I wrote the cover story that ultimately became Alienation, National Review said nothing whatever about it. And that wasn't because they thought it was impolitic to discuss it, as they subsequently did. I mean, they as you know, National Review purged all its immigration patriots in 97 and basically changed sides, shut up about the issue. That was because they were afraid of the congressional Republicans and afraid of the neocons and all that kind of thing. But in between 65 and 95, it was just that they were just brain dead on it. They just didn't think about it. Most people didn't. I mean, you know,
I think Pat Buchanan has said something similar, in that he didn't really take notice of the issue until, I believe, the late 80s. There's interviews saying he's like, well, I didn't really think about this issue until, you know, I started looking into it about the time that the Cold War was starting to end, that this was like an issue that actually we needed to focus on domestic issues. And at that time, you know, in the early to mid 90s, there was kind of a national populist moment. You had Pat Buchanan's presidential campaigns in 92 and 96, and where in 96, he came in a respectable second, and he had shown that he had a strong power base within the GOP that was all for, you know, what Trump ran on 20 years later, you know, immigration restriction, trade protectionism, bring our troops home, everything like that. And even though the Republican Party, he endorsed Dole, he got nothing from the party. There were no rewards for him endorsing Dole. Dole just ran on an establishment message, even though at this time there was this national populist moment. And there were several other things. There was Prop 187 in California, which wanted to crack down on illegal immigration. The media was hysteric about it. And then roughly 60% of Californians voted in favor of it, including most African Americans and I think Hispanics as well. David Duke was a serious political figure at that time for a brief period. He nearly won statewide office. He got 40% of Louisianans voted for him in the gubernatorial race in 91. So you had all these things that were happening at that time.
From our
also your book.
From our point of view, when I wrote the afterword to the for the paperback edition, which I did in Christmas of '95, just about 8 or 9 months after Alienation came out, we all expected then that there would be some type of patriotic immigration reform and a significant reduction in numbers, because, you know, we'd had this Jordan Commission, headed by Barbara Jordan, who was a black congresswoman who unfortunately died before the thing was published. And her report was strongly in favor of reducing immigration because of the labor market impact and stuff. So they had perfect cover for it. Here's this liberal Democrat, with bipartisan
Bill
commission.
Clinton sort of, and I'm not sure if it was a full endorsement, but he definitely received it positively. And
he did. I was on the road with with debating the usual suspects or the immigration theorists when that came out, and they were horrified. Clinton instantly endorsed the conclusions of the report. And he only backed. That's because he had been defeated in Arkansas because the backlash to the Mariel boat lift when they brought in all these Cubans. He was aware that this was a really hot and dangerous issue, and he was determined that he wasn't going to be forced to run as an as an immigration enthusiast, as Joe Biden appears to want to run this time around.
And the weird thing is that Republicans
what happened was the Republicans just ran away. They put no pressure on him at all. And when he realized that was going to happen, he just got back on side again. Now the question is, why did the Republicans do that? And I think there are a number of culprits. A major one is just sheer stupidity, and another one is the enormous power of the donor class, which we really only just begin to grapple with at that time. It's hard to believe this, but in the late 70s and early 80s, we didn't think very much all that much about donors. It's only really in the last 10 years that it's become clear that they are essentially a separate party that just runs both major parties are run to a substantial extent by the donors. And I think the other issue is the neocons. Who were a double-edged sword. They're extremely useful to have all this bunch of New York intellectuals come on board in the late 70s, motivated by the Cold War, which was a very real thing. I know it's hard to believe for anyone if you're age, but the Cold War was an extremely real thing, and American conservatives generally really thought they were going to lose. So that having the neoconservatives around making these arguments against communism and against détente and so on was extremely useful. But it turned out, which we never expected, that they were completely nuts about immigration. And they wouldn't tolerate any dissent on the immigration issue. I think that's one of the lessons that became clear with the reception to Alienation, because it was the neoconservatives, people I know personally, people like Norman Podhoretz and so on, who were most ferociously hostile to it and opposed it in the most vitriolic terms. And that frightened a lot of people. A lot of people just simply frightened off by the reception that I got, and of course the reception that Pat got as well. I mean, he was very comprehensively demonized.
Surprisingly, one of the few neocons to have a sensible immigration position is David Fromm, who's the most violently anti-nationalist neocon. Right? Well, I mean, it's actually a tough competition to be the most anti-nationalist neocon, but he is one of them, and he's most famous for writing the infamous op-ed for National Review on patriotic conservatives, attacking all the paleocons who were opposed to the Iraq War, and going after pretty much everyone who is an immigration restrictionist who may have thought that we shouldn't be using American power to impose democracy all over the world. And now he's like viciously anti-Trump, and he's supporting all these open borders Democrats, even though he largely still believes in immigration restriction. I think he wrote an article in The Atlantic in either 2017 or 2018 that was still supporting a more common sense view of immigration. He's
been consistently good on immigration. He actually reviewed Alienation favorably. He's been consistently good on immigration. The problem is he doesn't seem prepared to fight about it. I mean, I remember when that Atlantic article came out, going through and looking at his Twitter thread, and the hostility that he was facing from people who he wants to appeal to, American liberals.
They're all calling him a Nazi and everything. Right. Everything that he calls Trump, they were then calling him that for writing this sensible article about it.
Now, to be fair to him, he's never actually reneged on it. He just doesn't talk about it very much. Somebody else who's like that,
any politician who seems to support it. I mean, Trump was out of a lot of conservatives, mainstream conservatives, he was one of the few of them among their ranks who is willing to take Trump seriously and to offer qualified defenses of him in the primary, and up until around, I think, September of 2016, when he just decided that he's going to be fully anti-Trump, he was still wavering in, and he was still offering defenses. He's like, well, I agree with his immigration policy. And he was also saying the conservative ink had failed to address the real issues of Americans, which Trump is actually doing. But I guess he decided that he's controlled by Putin and would be disastrous for Fromm's foreign policy vision. And ultimately what his main priority is neoconservative foreign policy. Everything else comes secondary.
I think one of the issues is that there's obviously an extraordinary degree of hysteria in the American Jewish community about Trump. And it really is beyond the reach of reason, because of course, I mean, you know, obviously Trump has actually gone out of his way to be extremely pro-Israel, and he's totally surrounded by Jews, and you know, it's hard to see quite what it is, but it's. I guess it's one of these implicit white things. At some very deep level, he really seems to upset them, and I think it's very easy, if you're not Jewish, to underestimate what it's like, because of course they all socialize together and they go to synagogues together and everything. Then they realize how intensely hostile the rest of the community is, and it's very hard to remain in that community. I mean, there are Jews who do, of course, support Trump and are out of this, but I think the peer group pressure that those people are under is quite extraordinary.
Yeah, and he's definitely more in with a liberal Jewish crowd that is more likely to be anti-Trump. And he is somebody who wants respectability, and he does realize that being a Trump supporter is the easiest way out of respectability. And so there are some ulterior motives to his flip from going from somebody who would offer qualified defenses of Trump to being one of the most hysterically anti-Trump people. But going back to the 1990s, you know, and this national populist moment you had a book that was out that was, you know, catching, you know, a lot of attention. Several academic studies were talking about how this shows the dangerous rise of nativism and everything like that. And you also had the bell curve that came out, I think like 2 or 3 years before your book.
About a year before.
Yeah, about a year before. And it came out. It was also getting attention, was also selling a lot of books. Everybody was talking about it and warning about how this is bringing back racism and everything like that. But it was connecting with the public. So it was not just, you know, on the political level, it was also on an intellectual level where you had this interesting dissident right moment. But it fizzled out into the 90s. Why do you think it wore out as the decade went on? Because in the 2000s, you definitely, I was old enough to realize what was going on in the news at that time, not so much in the 90s. But you really didn't have anyone saying these points, you know, when I was watching Fox News in like 2002 or such. But so it seemed to fizzle out as the decade went on. So why do you think that happened?
It didn't fizzle out. It was simply smothered. I mean, they put the genie back in the bottle by very brutal methods. I mean, Buckley was prevailed upon to purge National Review, but he fired John O'Sullivan, the editor, and all of us who were involved with immigration patriotism were constructively dismissed, and we had no place else to go after that. And that's why I had to found vdare.com. It was literally impossible to get facts and analysis about the immigration disaster into public debate because nobody would publish them. And that goes particularly for the Wall Street Journal. The neoconservatives, it was part of a process by which the neoconservatives established complete control over the conservative intellectual world. And they simply went about extirpating all their opponents. That's why Mel Bradford didn't get the position he wanted, the conservative Southern historian, and
that was in the Reagan administration in the 1990s.
Yeah, that whole tradition of American conservatism, the Southern tradition, was simply extirpated and exiled, and so on. Sam Francis was fired, and at the behest of neoconservative operatives, and he lost his position at the Washington Times and so on. And they just systematically suppressed all opposition, and they got control of the net with these.
And I think this also translated into, you know, on the electoral level as well. I mean, there was not a Pat Buchanan candidate in the 2000 Republican primary. I mean, your two top candidates were John McCain and George W. Bush, who are arguably the worst Republicans on immigration, maybe of all time. And they were the top two candidates in 2000. There wasn't any real senators or congressmen who were getting into this issue in the early 2000s as well. I mean, later on in the 2000s, you had, Tom Tancredo and a few others who this became their main issue. But from, you didn't have anybody, you didn't even have somebody like Pete Wilson, who was not necessarily an ideologically committed to these ideas. He just realized that they were politically popular and he adopted them himself. You didn't have anybody like that who was a big name Republican. Everybody, and when the 2006 amnesty fight occurred, all of these Republicans were insisting that they love legal immigration and they want more legal immigration, but we need to make sure it accommodates the rule of law. And there was very terrible arguments used then. And so you didn't see these ideas that were getting mainstream attention, say in 1994, 1995, being articulated by politicians, which is something very different today when Trump can tweet out ideas that were once considered extreme and fringe, and now it's becoming almost policy.
Don't know whether that's because of him being in the White House, of course, and he's been able to change a lot of people's minds, such as, for example, Charlie Kirk. It's amazing what being in power does in terms of persuading people that you're right. I have, by the way, on the site, the afterwards, the Kindle edition of Alienation, which is about 15,000 words long, and that is a history of the entire period. And this very long period when any kind of immigration patriotism was simply kept out of public debate, except online. And we were lucky that they hadn't figured out how to suppress us online at that point, which they're working on very hard right now.
Going back to how
I think it's still the case. We made this. I think it's still the case that the congressional Republicans are extremely anxious not to see champions of immigration patriotism emerge, particularly in the Senate. Because, of course, Jeff Sessions did a tremendous job when he was in the Senate on the issue, and Tancredo to some extent in the House. But after Tancredo left the House, there was nobody in the House who would propose a moratorium bill. The party discipline among congressional Republicans was extraordinary. And again, I do put that down partly to the rise of the donor class, who are actually the neoconservatives. I mean, you've got Paul Singer or Sheldon Adelson, who are big Republican donors. They're obviously neoconservatives in their interests and their foreign policy predilections and so on.
Most of the donors and political leaders, such as Mitch McConnell, they just want to focus on business-only issues. They just want the tax cuts. They want to get judges in there who are going to favor business interests, and that's it. Like, immigration, they're not going to try to push forward an amnesty at the moment, but they just don't want to address it. And anyone who addresses it and makes it their main issue, he's a nuisance that they don't want in. They just want a toady who's going to, toe the party line and focus on the business first issues. They're not going to actually articulate nationalism. It's
particularly extraordinary because it is now absolutely obvious that these different racial groups who have been imported through immigration are not going to vote Republican. And their impact on the political landscape is very, very dramatic and gets worse and worse every year. And yet the Republicans seem to be simply won't think about it. They just simply won't think about it. Now, maybe that's because the people in power think they're going to just run out the clock and retire to K Street or something. But even so, it's surprising that some more of the younger people don't. And the thing that most amazes me, of course, is the complete implosion of the California Republican Party. Because that's a situation where 3 times the California electorate walked up to them, banged on the door, and passed an anti-bilingual education initiative, an anti-legal immigration initiative, an anti-affirmative action initiative, just through sheer popular force, opposed in every case by the Republican leadership and, of course, the entire media class and the Democrats and so on. I mean, it couldn't have been made clearer that there was a real market and a real hunger for leadership on these national question issues, and yet the Republican Party never picked it up. I simply don't understand it. I mean, Diana West says she thinks that there are just infiltrators inside the Republican Party. Their job is to make sure that they're not an effective opposition, and that actually is the simplest explanation.
Yeah, and I think it's just that they're too focused on these business issues, that Republicans don't have the imagination to look at cultural and social issues and realize that they really don't understand demographics. I mean, in California, they were doomed by demographics. These were the last efforts to stave off that an eventual outcome.
You know,
then,
Scott, they're not that doomed by demographics. I mean, the fact is that Republicans
in California,
they don't normally in California they don't normally carry at the presidential level. They quite often don't carry the white vote in California, and that's partly because they don't mobilize the very large areas of California, which is still substantially American. You know, in Eastern California, Northeastern California, and so on, and the rural areas. They just make no effort to appeal to these people on a direct national question appeal.
And in a lot of areas,
I mean,
there's also the question of, in a lot of areas
Party,
of California, it's the same in Northern Virginia, where you have all these white liberals congregate in an area that, and California has a higher. I agree that it's also the point that they can't motivate those voters who should be voting for them to actually go out and vote for them, because the California GOP is the most uninspiring, one of the most uninspiring political vehicles in this country. I mean, they always put out, as somebody you actually particularly loathe is Neil Kashkari, who is a financier, Indian financier, who had whose whole message was engineered in like an AEI study group about what they think an ideal Republican could be. He went out there, he's like, I love immigrants and I'm not going to focus on social issues, and he loses by over 20 points.
That was a particularly interesting race, that gubernatorial race, because his main opponent there was Tim Donnelly, who actually was an anti-immigration conservative in California, and it looked like he was going to win. And the entire national establishment came down to stop him. George Will wrote a column boosting Neil Kashkari, who had been an Obama voter, and who Obama subsequently appointed to the Federal Reserve in Minneapolis. I mean, there's no reason to suppose he was in any way Republican, but they were simply desperate to prevent the immigration issue surfacing. And that was an issue that, because of these monster primaries that they have in California, it would have been a situation where Jerry Brown would have been running for re-election against the Republican. And Donnelly could have done a great deal of damage on the immigration issue, because, you know, it was the ball was out of control at that point with all these unaccompanied minors coming across. Donnelly could have done a great deal of damage, and he could have made the issue a national issue. But the Republican establishment itself was desperate not to have that happen.
You know, going back to your book, there's a certain point. You know, we're talking about how what you're arguing in your book. You know, liberal journalists would shriek about it today. And one of the things that made your book stand out is that you focus on the racial angle of immigration. That was, of course, the most controversial thing, and how current levels of immigration are going to fundamentally change America. So my question is, how did you sneak this past your publisher and National Review? Because at this time, imagining National Review publishing something like this today is almost unthinkable, and especially a major publisher, which you were published by either Simon & Schuster or Harper
Random House. Random House.
I got it wrong. Neither of the options. So how did you sneak this past your publisher and National Review?
Well, Random House, you know, National Review, you have to remember, I mean, that was, it seemed like a long time at the time, but National Review had, and Buckley had, opposed the Civil Rights Act in the mid 60s. Now, this, of course, was nearly 30 years later, but there was a record. They had been much franker about the racial issues, racial problems, while in the lifetime of people who were still at the magazine, like Buckley and Bill Rusher and so on. I got it through, frankly, because of John O'Sullivan, who was then the editor, who had been an aide to Mrs. Thatcher, and also editorial page editor of the New York Post and so on. And Buckley appointed him as editor. And John's method of doing this was he simply kept in touch with where I wrote the story, which became very, very long. It was ultimately 13,000 words. It really dominated the whole. It squeezed practically everything else out of the magazine. And he waited the last possible minute before giving it to Buckley, who was flying to Japan, I think, or something at the time. And nobody else saw it, and Buckley signed off on it, and because he read it and signed off on it, and it was published. And there were a lot of people at the magazine at the time, for example, Rich Lowry, and for that matter, Larry Kudlow, who I'm sure really, and of course Panuru, who really hated it, but they just didn't get to vote. So we had a good time for about 5 years, because we were taking an immigration patriot line on the magazine, even though significant numbers of the staff hated it and opposed it. Buckley, you know, is a strange figure, and I wrote a long obituary for him when he croaked. He wasn't, in an odd way, in his latter part of his life, he was not actually all that interested in politics. And to the extent he was interested in politics, his ideas were not all that bad. And so nothing I said in the my article really upset him. He only changed sides when it became obvious how much the neoconservatives hated it and how much the congressional Republicans hated it. And these were people who were very important to him socially. Now, to move on to Random House, the Random House, the book was, of course, grew directly out of the cover story, which caused a great deal of uproar at the time. And with Random House, I got really lucky. There was the top editor of Random House was an Englishman called Harry Evans, who had been the editor of the Sunday Times in England, and who married that woman. What the hell's her name now? I forgot. She edited Vanity Fair for a long time.
Oh no, I know what you're talking about. I can't. I think it's like Brown or something. I can't remember.
Oh, Tina Brown.
Yeah,
Tina Brown. Anyway, Evans had been editor although he regarded himself as a man of the left, he made editor of the Sunday Times when Enoch gave his speech in '68, and he knew what a tremendous impact it had. So he just instinctively thought that this book would have a tremendous impact. And I guess he didn't realize quite how vitriolic the resistance would be in the US. The arguments didn't strike him as unreasonable. And so he got behind it and gambled on it. I don't think Random House, the people at Random House liked the book either, because they didn't do a very good job with the laydown. But, you know, a funny story, Evans said to me, you know, that he'd been speaking somewhere in New York and with Bill Kristol, and Bill Kristol was on the platform. And in the course of this, these talks, these speeches they gave, Evans expressed a support for the idea of official English in the US. Official English in the US, you know, has always been an issue which has had a lot of liberal support. It used to, anyway. It was
definitely not anymore.
No, I think because of the Great Awakening, they moved far to the left. But at one stage, it was a way. Walter Cronkite, for example, was on the board of US English and all this stuff, you know. But he said, to his great surprise, Bill Kristol, who at that stage was regarded, you know, as a conservative, and had, of course, been in Dan Quayle's chief of staff. So his great surprise, Kristol was extremely angry about it and accused him of being a nativist. So you see, there's these ethnic antagonisms.
And the same people who are worried about nativism are like, oh, we just need the immigrants to assimilate. Yet they have a knee-jerk reaction to the idea that they should speak English.
Yeah, they just don't actually want anything to do anything about it. So I mean, so that was very interesting to me because Kristol was actually on the board of National Review at that stage, and it was before we really realized how extremely hostile these neoconservatives were to any discussion of the immigration issue.
Your book also. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
It just wasn't obvious at that point that they should be. Were they patriots or not? Well, it turned out, of course, that they're not.
Yeah, no, not at all. And not only did your book challenge, you know, the conservative lethargy on this issue, it also was challenging all of the mountain of propaganda that the average American has to hear about immigration. You know, we're told that we're a nation of immigrants, that we've always been a haven of refugees and everything like that. But you documented about how, you know, this hasn't always been the case. We've always had immigration laws. We've always, you know, had naturalization acts and everything like that don't, you know, comport to the fairy tale image of this. And, you know, one person who some of my followers always like to say is actually a based and a really great president is John F. Kennedy. But in a lot of ways, John F. Kennedy is responsible for this because, of course, he published a book or wrote, well, he didn't really write, but it was published under his name. And it was book published by the Anti-Defamation League. And it was called Nation of Immigrants. And this was a bestseller. And this book then later served as a blueprint for his brother's efforts in the 1965 Immigration Act. So how much of this would you blame on the Kennedy family of the current immigration dogmas? I mean, a lot of people want to put it on just Ted Kennedy, but a lot of people on the right, especially the dissident right, want to have a positive image of John F. Kennedy. I still haven't yet to really figure out why so many people are fervently in love with JFK, even though he's pretty much terrible on every issue, from especially immigration, civil rights. He got us into Vietnam and everything like that. So how much would you blame this on the Kennedy family for where we are today with his immigration mess?
I mean, the Kennedy family ultimately have emerged as left-wing Irish Democrats. Left-wing, you know, you do get these extremely left-wing Irish Americans, and they seem to be in that category. But I think also it's partly a question of just assimilating into the Jewish upper class. You know, how many of them have intermarried with liberal Jews, and I think that's also an issue there. And it's of course a paradox because. It's a paradox because the National Review was also run by Irish Catholics, but they were conservatives. I would blame Johnson most of all. I don't think we've ever gotten this thing through without the 65 Immigration Act, without Johnson, and I don't think it would have been passed at all, except for the great spasm of emotion that followed Kennedy's assassination, and also, of course, the Civil Rights Act. Which has basically just taken over the entirety of American politics, as Chris Caldwell has documented in his new book. Now, what Johnson's motives were, I find extremely difficult to grasp. I don't think that the Robert Caro is writing this great biography of Johnson, but I don't think it's covered that period yet. And as he's now in his late 80s, I don't see how he will ever publish it.
I think he was just trying to uphold Kennedy's legacy by doing this. There's always the argument that he got through the 64 Civil Rights Act in part to, uphold that legacy that, everyone had a positive image of JFK after his assassination, and that there was the political capital to get his more, things that were less popular through are the things that were more controversial, such as the Civil Rights Act and the Immigration Act. Do you think that this was just him, that there was like no ideological concern? This is just like, I want to fulfill JFK's legacy. And it's a way of almost one-upping him, because he did always have this resentment towards the Kennedys, and he wanted to have the legacy of, I actually got what they wanted done. Do you think that played any role?
It's possible. I mean, he's a much more effective legislator. And it is also true that the Immigration Act was presented in an incredibly deceptive way. I mean, almost nobody had any idea that this was what was going to happen, what was about to happen. All critics were just all brushed aside. And it's possible that Johnson didn't think about it, or most people voted for it, I'm quite sure, didn't think about what the implications of it would be. But I also think that Johnson was a much darker and more perverse personality than people generally realize, and he was not a man of the right. I mean, he had a lot of class antagonisms and so on from growing up very poor in Texas. So it's a question that really needs some thinking about. I mean, the thing about the Immigration Act and the Civil Rights Act is that after they passed, they went completely out of public discussion. Nobody ever discussed the implications. I've always thought I'd like to go back and trace the point at which it became illegal and immoral to mention the race of criminals. And I suspect that it was after the Civil Rights Act when it turned out that integration was followed immediately by a great wave of crime. And I genuinely think that a lot of people who pushed through the Civil Rights Act, the Northern Republicans and so on, had no idea this would happen. They really thought that if they could just move segregation out of the way, that the American dilemma would be resolved, and blacks would integrate.
Instead, it only got worse after
exactly.
other efforts.
But of course, the response to this was to say, you can't discuss that. And similarly with the Immigration Act. I mean, for example. I tried very hard when I actually worked on Capitol Hill for Orrin Hatch, a senator, amazingly enough, in 1980, and I tried very hard to get him to address the affirmative action issue, the issue of racial quotas. I mean, in retrospect, that was only 16 years after the Civil Rights Act was passed, but there was absolutely no discussion of it. Even though it had become, in the most amazing transformation, the Civil Rights Act sponsors specifically denied it would require quotas in government and in the private sector. As soon as it was passed, they reversed themselves and started imposing quotas, and nobody could talk about it. Fred Lynch's book on the impact of quotas on white men is called Invisible Victims, precisely because he said there was no documentation, there was no coverage of what the impact of quotas was. It just was not discussed in the mainstream media.
And there was almost
similarly with the downsides of the immigration issue were never discussed. I mean, as I say, there's a period there of close to 30 years when immigration was not discussed in National Review at all.
And there was a concern even among the right. The right was almost, in some ways, too focused on the Soviet Union and communism and foreign policy to actually concern itself with domestic policy, even though busing, which was an outgrowth of a lot of these legislation from the 60s, that did merit conservative opposition because parents were actually having to deal with this problem and people were angry about it. And Republicans and conservatives had to actually talk about this issue because their constituents were all angry about it. And I think a lot of the ways that they were able to ignore this is that most Americans didn't notice these effects of immigration. I think affirmative action too, probably they were noticing a little bit more, but they weren't noticing the horrible effects of mass immigration until the 80s.
I think people did notice it, Scott, because they moved away from immigrant impacted areas, just as they moved away from areas where schools were integrated. They did notice it, but they had absolutely no voice and no leadership. And that's a really interesting question and goes to the nature of the American political.
But it came out in the early 90s, which you didn't have this at all. I mean, as we were discussing before, is that you had, Prop 187, you had all these bills that were people actually talking about this, and also growing outrage at the, 86 amnesty. And there was a building coalition in the, mid 90s to actually reverse what was the standard procedure on immigration policy from then in the mid 90s, actually try to restrict it. And unfortunately it failed. But you almost see from 65 to the mid 90s, you see like 30 years of inaction on this, or everyone just trying to reward immigration.
Having said that, when I published Alienation in 95, the demographic data was very clear that Americans were fleeing California, both white and black Americans, by the way, because of the empire. They were actually moving away from the immigrant impacted areas. At that point, it was 6 states that were primarily affected. And Americans are moving away from these areas. So at an individual level, people knew there was problems, but it just failed to get the attention of the political leadership for reasons which really bear looking into. I mean, America in many respects is betrayed by its intellectual class, which is consumed by it's obsessed with dibbuks and golems, which bear no relationship to the life of the average American.
Exactly, and this is, and the one thing that we have good today is that there is actually the intellectual classes taking note of immigration. The difference is that the right is getting better on the issue, but the left is getting far worse on the issue, that any immigration limit is immoral and evil, which even 10 years ago, I mean, Obama would be called a fascist by some of the standards that liberal journalists have of immigration. Now, the fact that he would actually enforce immigration law, not to a real extent, but he at least deported people, which they feel that no deportation should happen. And
the white left, the white liberals have moved dramatically to the left, and in fact, the polling data seems to show. I guess it's what's called the Great Awakening, isn't it?
The Great Awakening.
And the reason for this is, is kind of hard to figure out. It may be, if you look at the Democrat Party, we did an analysis of the 2016 vote. And for the first time, a majority of Hillary's vote was what you might call non-normal Americans. That is to say, there were over 45% of them were people of color. And then the significant sections of them were either Jewish or homosexual. And I think that to the extent that there are sort of Gentile whites left in the Democratic Party, they've ceased to be a critical mass. They've ceased to have a voice of their own, and that's one reason why they're shifting dramatically to the left, because they've been told that their route to political power is by electing a new people, and so they're all in favor of that.
And there was a new data point showing that white liberals are more the driver of the extreme identity politics than even some of the non-whites in the party. Is that 49% of white Democratic voters said that they were uncomfortable with a white candidate, while for Black and Hispanic voters, it was like under 30%. So there is the significant drive is these affluent white liberals who have fully bought into the progressive orthodoxy and want it implemented in a radical mean, open borders, we're going to have trans rights, everything like that. And they fully believe in this idea, even more so than the minority voters in the Democratic coalition.
Yes, I think that it's not a stable situation, and I think we all personally know people personally who whites who work for Obama but have left the Democratic Party because they realize there's no room for them, and that's one of the great strengths that Trump has. I mean, there's this seismic shift going on inside the population. In the long run, the demographic changes will doom the Republican Party, but in the short run, it's going to benefit paradoxically because the party, the Democrats, have very openly abandoned the white working class, and
And going back on to Trump from the Democratic Party is that VDARE and a lot was a precursor to Trump. That if you look at the Trump 2016 agenda, the Conservative Inc. of course was not arguing for these positions, but VDARE was, and also even before he announced, spring of 2015, nobody thought that Trump was going to run. There was a famous BuzzFeed article, or I believe it was BuzzFeed, about how Trump is running a fake candidacy. I believe this ran in 2014 or 2015. It was written by McKay Coppins, and everyone thought it was a joke. Everyone was like, oh, he's never going to run. And I remember George Will betting money on Fox News that Trump, he bet money that Trump would win the primary just to get Trump in the primary because he thought it was a joke that he would ever run. But VDARE actually was taking him seriously before this. In April of 2015, your site ran an article saying he was the one immigration patriot, possible immigration patriot in the primary field. And it went through all these arguments that turned out to be true in 2016. And you also gave a speech in 2015, which you were discussing a little bit later, where you said all it takes is a spark. All it takes is one ambitious politician, someone who's prepared to drop the bomb on this issue, despite the advice of the political consultants. Sure enough, when Trump came down the escalator a few months later, he dropped the bomb on the political establishment. So,
of course, the reason I said that, Scott, is because I've seen what happened in England when Powell made his speech. And it's one of these situations where you put a flag up the flagpole and see who salutes, and everybody salutes. So I knew that if somebody made the speech, but if somebody did that, it would have a very dramatic impact. Partly because the left wouldn't be able to restrain themselves from attacking him. Now,
and which happened throughout
it turned out I was wrong.
It
didn't take a speech; it just took a soundbite. And of
course,
it
was only, I think, maybe like more than just a few sentences. It was a run-on sentence too. And that's all it took. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists. Some I assume are good people, and that was enough to set off, to make him the GOP front runner.
Now,
and that was all that's all it took.
I'm quite sure that that's from it's very hard for me to believe that as a long-time financial journalist, there's any plutocrat ever reads any book. But the campaign did apparently ask that Anne called to send him her book. Very typical of them. Why didn't they just go out and buy it? But that's how they are. And the one of the most powerful passages in Anne's book is the correlation between, of all things, Mexicans and child rape. There's a considerable ethnic specialization in crime, and Hispanics for some reason, tend to be very interested in child rape, and that's what he was referring to. And
it's very clear that he either got like an aide made like spark notes for him or something, but he was aware of these ideas when he was giving that speech, and that speech changed the course of American history.
Anne, bless her heart, has actually said several times that it was my immigration article in 92 in National Review that changed her mind on the subject. So I guess I can claim sort of a godfather relationship.
It's an influence chain there. No, that's very true. And Anne was very much supportive of VDARE for many years. And that these ideas informed her book, and those ideas informed Trump. So there's a very clear ties there. But, since then, Trump has, of course, been president. He's been very disappointing. He has not done everything we thought he was going to do. In a lot of ways, he's seen weak to actually make serious change. But what is your general assessment of the Trump presidency, and what do you think of its future?
I think that he's definitely still not Hillary. And he's not even Jeb Bush. And that's a wonderful, wonderful thing. because Hillary would have gone the full Merkel and brought in 200,000-300,000 Syrian refugees like Merkel did, and simply knocked out the Republican Party with amnesty, and that's what they'll do again if they win. And as far as Trump's re-election is concerned, of course, I do think he has an excellent chance of winning. Apart for the demographic reasons I was pointing out earlier, I mean, the Democrats are systematically alienating the white working class. Joe Biden has said that he thinks America could take in 2 million immigrants a year instead of what the current illegal.
He may say 20 million, depending on how where his mind takes him. I mean, Trump is also benefiting from the fact that Biden can't even read a teleprompter to form a coherent thought. Along with the issues of the Democrats.
I think the Democrats' thoughts on immigration generally are very coherent. They intend to elect new people, and it's so universally agreed among Democrats that the subject is hardly even debated, during the primaries and so on. But if it ever was debated, there was a massive competition to get as far to the left as they could on the issue. So I think that's going to be a huge problem for them. Of course, it requires Trump to actually raise the question, and he's not helped himself. Well,
he is raising the question with the moratorium proposal.
Yeah, he's not helped himself by backing up.
It doesn't have the teeth that we need, but it is raising the question, and it is going to be a campaign issue.
Yeah, he's there, and he can always raise it again. And of course, the good and bad thing is the Democrats are so far to the left on the issue that it's a huge opportunity. But unfortunately, it means he probably the way these political operatives think, that means they don't have to say anything. They can just not be Democrats. And that will get them elected, which it probably will.
Yes, and it will. And they're also putting forth a terrible candidate. I mean, increasingly, Joe Biden is showing that he doesn't have the mental capacity to do a lot of things, but especially run for president. I mean, every time he's on TV, there's a new gaffe that is outrageous, especially with the type of attention that it has Trump. It's the first candidate. It's possibly the only politician you could run against Trump where Trump sounds like the highbrow intellectual who can remember his thoughts and just run with it. They are running Joe Biden, who doesn't seem to know where he is half the time.
I think that speaks to something we were discussing earlier, by the way, Scott, which is the extent to which these parties are run by donors now.
Yes, and it clearly was with the Democrats. I mean, the establishment decided, they wanted somebody else to be they definitely didn't want Bernie. Bernie was the one person they didn't want, and he was clearly going to be the nominee if they didn't do something. And when Joe Biden won South Carolina, they're like, okay, well, Buttigieg isn't going anywhere. Klobuchar isn't going anywhere. Everyone hates Warren. Bloomberg, we also hate. They actually didn't want Bloomberg either. So they decided to settle on Biden. And it shows the type of different power dynamics that there are between the Republicans and Democrats. Republicans could have never pulled this move in 2016, where they could have convinced everyone to drop out and rally around Marco Rubio.
But look, Scott, that's because they already did this. That's how we got W. That's how we got Bob Dole. The establishment imposed these useless, awful, and the same with McCain. Actually, they imposed all these useless, awful candidates on the party, and they simply totally discredited themselves.
And in '96, there was a definitely thing because Pat Buchanan was a Trump then, and he had a serious chance to win. I mean, unfortunately, in 2008, there wasn't a serious Trump candidate. I mean, Tom Tancredo, of course, was running on these issues. Unfortunately, he didn't gain that much attention at that time. But there wasn't that serious candidate. There wasn't like a Bernie Sanders threat.
Of course,
in 2000 and 2008. Which they could, and they were able to crush Buchanan, but they couldn't crush Trump because Trump was always the front runner. Trump was always getting the most attention, and Trump didn't have to worry about donors because not only did he have so much money, but he was always getting TV. He didn't need ads, and Democrats were going to have the same issue with Bernie. They had a divided establishment field. He was on his way to nomination. And then they were able to convince Buttigieg and Klobuchar to drop out, and that was enough to seal the deal for Biden. It does. I mean, the Republicans wish they could have done that in 2016. I don't doubt that, but they had the inability to. They didn't have the candidate. They didn't have the power to do it, and the Democrats are picked the one candidate who, even in this situation, is probably the worst person to run against Trump. I used to think he was a better candidate against Trump, but I didn't realize how severe his his decline, his mental decline is, until I've been watching these interviews with him. It's really sad on a lot of levels.
You don't think that the media can cover up for him?
They cannot cover. They can't cover up for him. And every time they want to, because every time it's like them talking to their grandfather who's like 90 and he's not all there, and they're always like, yeah, say it. And their facial expressions anytime he's gaffing or just not knowing what he's saying is speaks volumes. They know they can't cover up for Biden. They're going to say the same thing like they did in 2016 when Hillary Clinton was clearly having health issues. And they're like, oh, this is a conspiracy theory. She's perfectly healthy, whatever. And then she collapsed coming from that 9/11 event, commemoration event. And they could no longer hide it. They can't hide that with Biden. Anytime he's on TV, it's clear that he's not all there. And the only time they can really make him up to be somewhat coherent is on these debate stages through lots of training. And even his own podcast, he... unlike here on Highly Respected, on his podcast, he always runs off on a train of thought, and that's when he has a script in front of him. So they're already attempting this because they're already saying it's a conspiracy theory to insist that he's having any mental decline. And these are the same journalists who are saying that Trump is senile and has all these mental illnesses, and they'll like run with these theories that he has serious mental health problems. But with Biden, it's a conspiracy theory and you can't talk about it. But everyone laughs at it. They can't hide this truth anymore, thanks to social media and new media. And they're not going to convince the tech giants to censor anybody who's playing an unedited clip of Joe Biden talking.
On the other hand, I think they have got to a considerable extent. They've tamed the internet in various ways through deplatforming and demonetization and so on. And that's a very serious problem, which of course Trump should have done something about. But because he doesn't read online, he doesn't know anything about him.
And I think if we are having...
There's a whole new range of issues ahead of us, Scott, that we have to deal with after Trump.
And on kind of in addition to that note, if Hillary Clinton was running against Trump with the same circumstances that we had in 2016, but with the big tech acting like it is today, Trump would have, of course, lost. And, the final question I have for you is, Trump, of course, you were, saying this before, is that Trump is not going to be around forever. What do you think of as the future of the Republican Party and America First Nationalists? Do you see somebody that could emerge as somebody who's Trump but better? Because clearly Trump had many of his issues. There's many disappointments with him. We want somebody like him, but who's actually going to implement this policy and intelligently articulate these positions. Do you see somebody emerging like that? Do you see this as the future of the GOP?
My observation of the American political system federally is that it's extremely creative at throwing up candidates. So I think it's entirely possible that somebody might come along and run on these issues. And Trump's been very useful in that regard because, as you say, he's raised issues which were basically suppressed for 15 years after the 2000 after Buchanan in 2000. So I think it's quite possible that somebody will come along and raise the issue. I also think it's possible that there could be a new party. There's been a talk about this for a very long time, going back to Lynn Nofziger, one of Reagan's chief aides towards the end of his life, which was he died nearly 20 years ago now, but he said that he'd come to the conclusion that the political system simply can't handle the immigration issue. And it's an issue every 100 years or so, you get a new party in American politics, and this may be time for it. And it may be that if Trump fails to get a grip on the issue, that somebody will come along and make specific proposals. I mean, I think they should, the issue should be put to American people. Do you actually want to be outvoted in your own country? Do you want to be replaced? And if you don't want to be replaced, you've got to do something about immigration right now. And it's not a question of economics. It's a question or of disease or anything like that. Although these are all important, but it's an issue of who you are. It's an issue of identity. Do you want to be a majority non-white country? And that strikes me as an entirely legitimate question to raise. I mean,
this question is not going to go away. regardless of what happens in the upcoming election, immigration is going to remain at the fore. These ideas are not going to disappear. I don't think we're going to have like the same scenario that happened in the the Bush era, where these ideas kind of were pushed aside out of the mainstream. You know, they were apparent in the early to mid 90s, and people weren't really saying them in the 2000s. These ideas are going to remain and be popular and be talked about for years to come. This is not, the national populist moment that Trump brought forth is not going to disappear at any time soon. And we're going to see, and whoever is the Republican nominee in 2024 is likely going to be running on these issues.
I certainly hope so. Anyway, we're going to do our best to keep it that way, Scott.
Anyway, this has been an excellent discussion. We're, of course, running out of time. We could talk all day about this. There's so much to talk about. But anyway, Peter, thank you for coming on. We need to have you back on soon. And Peter, of course, runs the terrific website, vdare.com, which is at vdare.com. And you should definitely buy his book, Alienation, which, what format do you suggest? It's of course available on Amazon.
It's currently only available in Kindle. And you can get to it. It's still on Amazon, or you can get to it through vdare.com. And sometime next year, probably at the time of the anniversary of the paperback, we'll put out a new hard copy edition. For some mysterious reason, I haven't been invited to do it by the mainstream publishing industry. So I have to do it
We
myself.
wonder why. Political dissidence, it does come with a cost. But Alienation is one of the really foundational texts of the dissident right. It's a highly recommended read where you can learn about the history of immigration policy and learn how people put these, quite alien notions to our country, such as that we're a nation of immigrants and everything like that, and how that became the orthodoxy. And so it's definitely a recommended read. But Peter, thank you for coming on. We definitely need to have you back.
Thank you for having me on, Scott. Good luck with the podcast.
Thank you. And until next time, stay respected.